Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Julius Caesar was assassinated on March the 15th on 44 BC. With that violent act, the Roman Republic effectively began irreversibly collapsing into what we eventually remember as imperial rule. His death, carried out in the Curia of the Theatre of Pompeii by senators, no less, who claimed to be defending liberty, accelerated the very concentration of authority that they claimed they were trying to resist. It's ironic if it wasn't so weirdly poetic at the same time. The conspirators imagined that daggers could restore the constitutional balance that they thought they lost, but their act plunged Rome into further civil war, if you might pardon the pun. It paved the way for the principate of his adopted heir, Octavian, who later adopted the name Augustus. The late Republic had already become structurally fragile. Expanding territorial conquests at a rapid rate brought immense wealth, slave labor, but also provincial complexity. And all of these were straining the republican institutions that were designed for modest city-states that had limited government. Military loyalty kept shifting from the Senate to charismatic generals, because the generals controlled legions that were personally devoted to them. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul enriched him. It strengthened his soldiers' allegiance, and it elevated his popularity among the masses. But when he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, he dramatized a reality that had been developing for decades. The Roman constitution could no longer contain his imperial ambition. It had overgrown itself. The assassination failed in that regard because it addressed a symptom. After Caesar's death, Rome endured renewed bloodshed. Mark Antony, Octavian, various Republican holdouts. Eventually, Octavian consolidated power through strategic alliances, propaganda, calculated propaganda no less, and ruthless elimination of rivals. In 27 BC, the Senate conferred upon him the title Augustus, inaugurating what historians call the Roman Empire. Outwardly, republican forms remained. And I want to be clear here, this was a bizarre empire. It maintained a lot of the republican structures. But in practice, all the authority was centralized under him, Octavian, Augustus. He commanded the army, he controlled provincial administration, he directed fiscal policy, and he did so with brilliant and decisive efficiency. That transition reshaped human civilization profoundly. In fact, I want to put it to you that if we are citizens of the West, every person listening and every person alive in the West has an obligation to know the history of Rome and the Roman Empire and to know how we benefit from it to this day. I want to share with you a couple of examples. First, the Pax Romana, or Pax Romani, the Roman peace or the Peace of Rome. It established extended stability across vast territories. So it's from Britain all the way to the Near East. Roads, the Roman roads, connected distant provinces with astonishing ability and straightness. Maritime routes also facilitated commercial exchange across the Mediterranean. A standardized legal framework across the entire empire developed and formed the foundation for later Western jurisprudence. Roman law, with its attention to property rights, contracts, some degree of individual rights, procedural equity, profoundly influenced medieval canon law and eventually modern civil codes. Economically, imperial governance started creating integrated markets that permitted goods, ideas, and people to circulate. I mean, this was remarkable speed for the ancient world. I just want to put this out there. Urbanization intensified like wildfire, and all of the Roman cities became administrative hubs and hubs of culture and trade. Inequality remained severe. Slavery persisted, and that's to be acknowledged. This is a Roman but historical reality as well. It wasn't isolated to just the Romans or the West. The structural coherence of imperial administration, though, provided a stable environment within which cultural synthesis flourished, intellectual synthesis grew. Philosophically and culturally, Rome was an absorbing organism. So all of the Greek intellectual traditions were not only preserved, they were translated and disseminated across the empire. Stoicism, Epicureanism, various mystery cults, all of these coexisted within this pluralistic environment because the Romans were pragmatic. This cultural permeability later proved decisive for Christianity. Thank God for the milieu that allowed Christianity to flourish, because the empire's infrastructure enabled ideas to travel, not just culturally, but also frankly along secure roads and maritime lanes. Its relative tolerance for diverse religious expressions created a space for freedom of religion, and these new movements emerged rather peacefully. There was persecution, don't get me wrong, but comparatively, this was a blessing. Theologically and historically, the rise of the Roman Empire provided the concrete stage upon which the Christian drama just unfolded. When Jesus of Nazareth entered history during the reign of Augustus, he did so within this political order. By that time, Rome had unified the Mediterranean basin under a single administrative umbrella. That's why I keep telling people, Mary and Joseph were never illegal immigrants. It's an historical fact. They went to Egypt, which was a region of Rome. They were subjects of the Roman Empire. The Gospel explicitly situates Christ within imperial chronology, Caesar, Augustus, and Pontius Pilate. The crucifixion employed a Roman method of execution reserved for rebels and criminals. Therefore, the empire functioned as an instrument of Christ's death, but also the medium for the proclamation of his resurrection and his gospel. The Apostle Paul traveled these Roman roads. He appealed to his Roman citizenship. He addressed communities that were situated in key Roman cities, Corinth, even Rome. The common use of Koine Greek across the eastern Mediterranean, combined with Roman administrative cohesion, allowed for his apostolic preaching to spread rapidly. In fact, it even paved the way for Thomas to take the gospel as far east as he did. Without the imperial network of transportation, communication, and relative peace, the early church's missionary expansion would have been stifled. Nevertheless, the empire also persecuted Christians periodically, like I mentioned. When the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor, clashed with Christian exclusivity, the worship of Christ, well, refusal to offer incense to the emperor was political defiance, and so persecution was rampant. However, that strengthened Christian identity. The narratives of the martyrdoms of Christians circulated widely, and over time, the church's moral vision, grounded in the inherent dignity of every human person, created in the image of God, gradually transformed the entire empire from within. It scandalized and revitalized Rome. By the 4th century under Constantine, Christianity was not a marginal sect anymore. It was a legally protected religion. And eventually, under his reign, it had favored status. This shift was an extraordinary civilizational development. A persecuted minority became the formative cultural force, because now Christianity shaped art and law and education and public morality and healthcare. The synthesis of the Roman institutional order, of Grecian intellectual heritage, and Christian theological anthropology produced what later scholars described as Christendom. That synthesis had complexities, I'm going to be honest here, but it shaped the entire West and Western identity. And that legal perspective is crucial. Roman concepts of citizenship, land rights, individual rights, they were reframed into the elevated Christian moral categories. Augustine and all of his compatriots and even thinkers after him reflected on Rome's rise and fall through a theological lens, distinguishing the earthly city and the heavenly city based on what was happening to Rome. The West inherited Rome's administrative genius, political structures, legal architecture, cultural confidence, intellectual heritage. Medieval Europe preserved Roman law in monasteries and universities as a structure, even if the substance came from the scriptures. Latin remained the lingua franca of scholarship and liturgy for centuries. And furthermore, the concept of the university and universal common law resonated deeply within the Catholic understanding of a universal church. The very idea of Western civilization came from the fusion of Roman structure and Christian faith. In other words, to put it all plainly for us, if we take a look at Caesar's death and the impacts thereof, when we consider the Ides of March, we observe not just a dramatic assassination. It was the pivot of an era in which Republican aspiration gave way to imperial consolidation that then gave way to the rise and triumph and flourishing of the Christian way of life that created the affluence and structure and grace and blessing that we have here in the West. Therefore, the empire that followed became, in providential irony, the historical stage for a kingdom. That kingdom's claim transcends every earthly throne. In other words, to put it plainly, the Catholic Church is thankful to the Roman Empire. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.